Welcome to Out of the Fold. This episode is the first part of 3 about Rachel Casey. She makes YouTube videos under the name Ex-Cult Baby, in which she re-examines biblical stories as an atheist. I put a link to her channel in the description. Definitely check her out. Her retellings of Lot and Job had me cracking up. When I interviewed Morris, he compared Mormonism to a cult, but we didn't really delve into it that much. He expressed it honestly, yet also said that it has cult-like qualities, but can be made more of one from person to person. More on that later, as I publish other interviews with ex-Mormons. Rachel, and many of the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who reached out to me after she announced she was coming on my show, introduced me to the BITE model for defining the traits that lead to mind control. BITE stands for behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotion control. A link to the site freedomofmind.com, which is the organization associated with the developer of the BITE model, Stephen Hassan, is in the description. Rachel and I don't speak much about this in our recorded conversation, but we did afterward, and I interviewed another ex-witness after her with whom I spoke about it a great deal. That conversation will be posted soon, but for now, listen for the things Rachel experienced that fall into the BITE model, and do your own research into it and the Jehovah's Witnesses afterward. No religious organizations, companies, or individuals were contacted for comment about any of the content of this episode. The views expressed are strictly those of the ones expressing them. Our conversation began on a Sunday morning.
I recently got engaged. Very excited about that.
Congratulations.
And thank you. I've known for some time that I was going to get engaged soon. My fiance and I, even when we had been dating for like 6 months, we were just kind of like, you know what? We know that we want to get married to each other. We know that we're compatible. We know that we are very good communicators with each other. We have long-term potential, and we want to, be with each other forever. So, but he said, okay, we have to wait until it's been at least a year so nobody thinks we're crazy. And I was like, that's fine, What's the difference between now and 6 months from now is that our relationship will be a little bit better. But I couldn't see us having broken up by then, and we didn't. So in the few weeks leading up to us getting engaged, which was basically just after we had been dating for a full year, I started to have dreams about talking to my family about the wedding and about getting engaged. And I basically just had this vision that I was going to get engaged. I was going to call my mom, and she wasn't going to pick up the phone. I just knew that was going to happen. I don't know. And when the time actually came, it was a staff Christmas party for the bar/coffee place that my fiance's mother owns. And we were all there together. I was with all my coworkers and my friends, and he got down on one knee, and it was very exciting. Of course, I said yes. I was very excited. And I went off to call my mom, and she didn't answer the phone. She called back a little later, though, and just to see if there was anything, wrong or anything like that, because she knew that if I was calling her, it must have been some kind of an emergency. Otherwise, I wouldn't even bother. And I told her, hey, I'm engaged. And she just kind of said, that's great. Congratulations. And there was just kind of an awkward pause. And I said, well, how is everybody at home? How are you guys doing? And she said, we're okay. And I said, okay. And she said, thank you for calling. Bye. And that's the last conversation I had with my mother. The Jehovah's Witnesses They have this teaching about, they don't call it shunning. In fact, they specifically don't use that word. If somebody comes up to them and says, "Oh, you guys have this shunning practice," they'll say, "No, we don't." But they have this practice called disfellowshipping, which basically, if you are a baptized Jehovah's Witness, if at any point in your life you commit some serious sin or supposedly serious sin, you will be removed from the congregation, and other Jehovah's Witnesses are forbidden from talking to you, including your family. Yeah.
What do they consider a serious sin?
Oh, loads of things. And some of them, sexual immorality, which is just any really form of sexual contact that takes place outside of a man-woman marriage. That's a big one. Apostasy is one, which is somebody who is talking about anything that is really contrary to doctrine. I don't know the whole list off the top of my head, but those are a couple of big ones. Smoking cigarettes is one thing that you can get disfellowshipped for. Drugs, getting drunk, even things that that are considered sinful but aren't like serious sins. If it's something that goes on for a long time, or you're just persistently doing, you can kind of get pre-shunned for. Like, they won't literally kick you out of the congregation, but people will stop hanging out with you who are in the congregation because they know that you're bad association. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So they avoid you as kind of a warning for you to, get your act together, and at the same time to keep themselves spiritually clean.
Now, you mentioned just now that you put just even, questioning, skepticism in general, that's considered apostasy. When I think of apostasy, I mean, I tend to think about specifically leaving, the actual act of leaving, but they considered even considering leaving, they considered that to be apostate behavior.
Oh yeah. That is a huge deal. When people say that they're having trouble with their faith, the congregation elders will come to them and try to help them out and, sit them down, have a bunch of scriptures, tell them about their personal experiences with, struggling with the faith. But it's really not, the idea of just having a faith crisis that makes you think you want to leave. It's more like, Jehovah's Witnesses are pretty much forbidden from, if anybody speaks out against witnesses, that information is automatically just lies. Anything negative said about witnesses in the news or by a person, that is apostate nonsense as far as they are concerned. If you even listen to them, if you even try to have a conversation with somebody who is considered apostate, if you watch what is considered apostate propaganda, on YouTube or anything like that, if you go to any apostate websites that explain why Jehovah's Witnesses are a really messed up religion and you shouldn't get involved in them, that's all considered apostate stuff. And if it is known that you are looking into that information, you can actually get disfellowshipped for that in some cases. Just seeking out that kind of thing.
Now, in the interview that I had with Morris, the ex-Mormon, he had mentioned that it sounded kind of silly, and we sort of laughed about it. Like, if there's somebody who's wearing shirts that aren't Mormon, that was considered like apostate clothing, or not approved by Mormonism. That was considered apostate clothing. There was something that was kind of silly about that, but I didn't get the sense that no religion really welcomes criticism and skepticism besides, really like Judaism and Buddhism. But for the most part, it's not like absolutely considered, that like you're nailing, you're hammering nails into the coffin by even considering it. Or even like wondering about it at all. Like a lot of people have crises of faith in their lives, but it sounds like Jehovah's Witnesses are not open to you considering it and then talking to somebody about it and then, potentially even strengthening your faith in doing so.
Oh, yeah. See, with witnesses, if you went to even like a close friend and was like, listen, I'm having these doubts, the way that the witnesses are taught, it's very much like a tell on other people type of thing, where if you know that somebody else is up to something, or if you know that they're involved in sinful conduct, or if you know that they are having doubts and are expressing these doubts to other people on top of that, then you're supposed to go to the congregation elders and tell them, or you need to tell your friend, you need to go to the elders or I will. And I have been in that situation before where I would, they literally they literally tell you to do that. Like, you have to tell on other people, otherwise you're an accomplice to their crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And, what you were saying before about, what is considered like apostate clothing and stuff like that in Mormonism, witnesses have a different term for that. It's anything that is like, not like Jehovah's Witnesses is considered worldly. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, that's a worldly hairstyle, or that's the worldly clothing. It's not considered like immediately a sin, but people will definitely judge you for it. And if I have had, I was giving a very brief presentation on stage at a congregation meeting, which is just like church, like a church event, weekly church event.
Right.
And at that meeting, apparently my skirt was just a little bit too short. It's not like anybody could see anything, but it was like right at my knees. And apparently it was an issue for some people because an elder counseled me about it after the meeting. And now, looking back, that's just like so silly, because it wasn't like, I had my legs spread or anything sitting on the stage. Nobody saw anything. And it wasn't too revealing, but just being even kind of sort of getting close to too short was enough for somebody to say something. And, just even having small doubts can, grow into big doubts in their minds. So even talking about really having doubts with just like a close friend, it is very likely that person is going to tell the elders for you about your issue so they could help you. I kind of consider, and I told you this before, I consider the Jehovah's Witnesses a cult. They're very controlling about information and things like that. And like I said before, they basically forbid witnesses from even looking at certain information about them, basically information about them from any source besides them, because they don't want people to even consider those possibilities,
Mm-hmm. So I went to an evangelical Lutheran school, and like I'm not going to say like I'm a scholar on the Bible or anything like that. Like, I'm sure there are things that I don't know about it, just as much as there are things about most things that I'm not an expert in. But I don't remember most of what you're talking about. With the practices of shunning and the practices of just completely pushing somebody away if they if they're even questioning it, or really, I mean, I don't remember that being scriptural. I know that there are different people that take it and take different things in different ways, but do Jehovah's Witnesses follow the Bible or a specific? I know you said they're non-Trinitarian, but I mean that could, Unitarians are non-Trinitarian. So I mean, what's the difference between what Jehovah's Witnesses believe in the Bible versus what they kind of ignore in the Bible?
The Jehovah's Witnesses, they do follow the Bible, obviously. They consider themselves Christian.
Right.
They believe in Jesus. They believe that his sacrifices are salvation, et cetera, et cetera. They don't believe that he died on a cross. They believe that it was like a stake or a pole, and that's a really big deal to them. And now that I'm out, I don't understand why that's such a big deal to them. Like, they're so like anti-cross. Like the possibility that he could have died on a cross as opposed to a stake or a pole, like they just totally reject that. And I think that that's, getting into the little nitpicky things. But the practice of shunning, according to them, is scriptural, and it's kind of like a loosely, it's really not, but there are verses that you can point to, like, I don't remember what verse it is exactly, but it says something like, if your brother is doing this or that, you don't even, sit down and eat a meal with such a person, something like that in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's in Corinthians or something like that. I don't remember. But that's kind of their scriptural basis for the shunning, is like one scripture that says something about not even sitting down and eating with somebody who is involved in sin. So they have a lot of things in there like that, where they don't celebrate birthdays. And the reason that they give is that there are only 2 birthdays celebrated in the Bible. And in both of those birthday parties, somebody dies. So therefore, God doesn't want you celebrating birthdays because he paints them in a very unfavorable way in the Bible. And that's just nonsense, like God makes so many specific laws in the Bible that you'd think if he didn't want you to celebrate birthdays, he'd just say don't celebrate birthdays as a law. Mm-hmm. There's so many laws in the Bible. Why not include that one if that's what you really want? They don't accept blood transfusions on the basis that you're not supposed to eat blood according to the law. And to them, ingesting blood and getting blood transfused into you in a life-saving medical procedure are exactly the same thing. This doctrine was enforced in the 60s, I think. It's been implemented for like 50-some years now. And since it's been implemented, a conservative estimate has said that basically probably something like upwards of 30,000 Jehovah's Witnesses have died because they didn't get a blood transfusion. The study was something like, okay, so let's say, well, it happens today that only like 1% of Jehovah's Witnesses who refuse blood transfusions die because there are alternative procedures that they use. So let's just say 1% of all of them die, 1 out of 100. Now figure in how many Jehovah's Witnesses there are, how often people need blood transfusions, and how long this rule has been in place, and you figure something like 30,000 people have died of this. Based on a really, really loose scriptural interpretation, it's stuff like that that makes people doubt. Because when they stop and think about this, it's like that seems like not a very good basis for all of this, for how many people have died. When somebody loses a loved one to this, that's when they stop to think, was this worth it? That scripture that says not to eat blood? I mean, really?
What that sounds like to me, honestly, is like, so I mean, we all have different interpretations of holy books, but I mean, that mm-hmm. sounds like blatant reading into it, and like blatant, that's even too weak of a term. It sounds like blatantly wanting to read what you want to read in it. It doesn't mm-hmm. it doesn't sound like you're even trying to interpret it correctly. It sounds like somebody who had that idea and was searching for a way to justify it biblically.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And same thing with the birthdays, like you really have to read that into it because it's not there. You have to go looking for it. You have to go looking for something to justify your position instead of reading the Bible and getting your position from it. You have to have your own position and then go looking to justify it to come to that conclusion. Mm-hmm. Some other stuff that the witnesses believe that's pretty different. They believe that God's name is Jehovah. They have their own translation of the Bible that they prefer to use. It's called the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures. Growing up, I was told repeatedly, over and over again, this is such an accurate version of the Bible. The translators, they took years to do this. It was a huge project, very scholarly. And they said that it's, one of the most accurate Bible translations. And I remember at some point Googling it and just, Googling most accurate Bible translation. And as far as I can remember, the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures never came up in that Google search. And it was little things, yeah. But that didn't make me doubt. That just made me go, okay, well, not enough people know about this Bible, apparently.
Right.
And I just went back to my business because they really do just brainwash you into just accepting what they say, word for word. Because, even when I did do at least even a little bit of research outside of it, it was just not true. And even faced with that, I just went back to my business and shrugged my shoulders and, kept, swallowing what they were giving me.
Well, if you were doing that when you were young also, I mean, you probably felt like, any sort of considering or questioning or anything like that would have been a total betrayal. I mean, it's easy when you're young to ignore that kind of thing. When you get older, it's a little bit tougher just because you know more and you have a little bit more confidence. But when you're young and you're being told that all of that is going to be sinful to do that, it's just like, oh, it's not there. Well, I should probably just move on anyway.
Mm-hmm. And the funny thing is that being raised in, they call it being raised in the truth, because calling it the truth just reinforces the idea that there's no need to question this.
Right.
But being raised in the truth, there were some rules that I missed, which is kind of weird to say, but there are some rules that I missed because it wasn't like somebody knocked on my door and introduced the message to me and was giving me all the rules, learning it for the first time. I grew up around it, and there were just certain things that people assumed that I knew, which led to some problems for me later. And after I got out of it, led to me going, what? They said that?
Right.
That's what they taught? Really? Like, I learned after I had gotten out that when two Jehovah's Witnesses get married, the congregation elders basically come and tell them what they are and are not allowed to do in the bedroom, which is basically just, you guys are allowed to do missionary, have fun. And that blew my mind when I heard about that, because I had never heard such a thing, but at the same time, I'd never dated a Jehovah's Witness or planned to marry a Jehovah's Witness. So I guess that would make sense that I would never hear about such a thing, but it was just another one of those things that makes me go, why do they care about all of these little things? And to me, that's just kind of further like, okay, this is kind of a cult. They can micromanage everything you do down to what you are allowed to do with your own marriage mate in your own bedroom. I mean, it just...
Right, like who benefits from making a rule about only being allowed to have missionary sex?
Yeah,
like the married couple definitely doesn't, and then it's not like the Jehovah's Witnesses are gonna feel like they're better off.
Nobody else is gonna know about it. It's not gonna affect anybody else.
Right. That's odd, and I actually don't think that's scriptural. I mean, maybe in the one that you described that you couldn't even find when you Googled it. But I mean, I remember, and again, like I'm not a Christian anymore, but I remember these things. I actually remember that, like, it didn't say go crazy on each other, but it said like if two married people consent to doing whatever, like that's okay in a marriage bed.
Exactly. I don't. There really is no scriptural basis for these things, for a lot of those things. And people just take it as, okay, well, if you're telling me to do this, then because they believe that, the Jehovah's Witnesses, that's God's chosen organization, and and they basically train them through a lot of propaganda, literature, and videos. They are constantly mass producing magazines, books, pamphlets, brochures, and videos that are all trained to to fill people's heads and just keep them brainwashed for as long as possible. Like, they are constantly putting out more and more and more propaganda. Like, I don't know of, that's one thing, at least as far as, a lot of religions go, that I have never seen anywhere else, is just the mass production of propaganda constantly. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of maybe, I don't know, the Watchtower magazine. That's
heard of
one
it,
of
yeah.
the most, that's one of the most popular things that they place at doors with people. They also have the Awake magazine. They have their own study edition of the Watchtower, which is for them to study at congregation meetings. And by study, I mean read the questions and highlight the answer in the paragraph and then recite it word for word at the meeting. I mean, it's just the most, like, looking at it now, it's almost funny, because I just realized that it's just all this repetitive brainwashing type of stuff. And at the time, it was just, a lot of witnesses are raised in it. I think that there's like way more people that are raised witnesses than there are converts, from knocking on doors. And I think that is kind of telling, because most of the people that they do get to convert from the door-to-door ministry work are a lot of people who are emotionally distressed in some way. And they do specifically target people like that. I've seen and heard of, and this is going to sound really, really gross, honestly, but there are witnesses that will, go in the obituaries and write letters to people's families that they find the names of in obituaries, because they know that those people, well, in their mind, they know that they need to hear the message of God right now. But the reality is they are targeting people who are emotionally distressed, because those people are going to be a lot easier to get to listen.
This would all be really funny if they weren't doing things like that, and if there weren't tens of thousands of them that were dying because they didn't get blood transfusions. Right. It's yeah. That's kind of exactly how I look at it. And that's why I think it's very important for me personally to speak up about this. Whenever somebody is like, what? This is your first time celebrating your birthday? Or like, what? This is, you've never seen Harry Potter? I'm just like, listen, I was raised in a cult. Let me tell you about it. Yeah. You need to know. This is why, okay? I don't always get pop cultural references. I'm quite naive. There are a lot of things I don't know about living in the real world. I am so behind on politics. But those things are all things that were basically trained out of me. Or really, I was never even exposed to. It's all new to me. I've only been out of the religion for a little over a year. But I've already learned so much, and it only took me maybe a few months to realize, that whole thing is starting to smell like bullshit. Mm-hmm. A little bit. Yeah. And I want to go back to the blood transfusion things briefly, if you don't mind. So how have you seen that affect somebody? Like, you've read about people that have died because of it, but were you ever in a church community or a community of Jehovah's Witnesses that knew that somebody died because they weren't willing to get a blood transfusion?
Not that I can remember. I've seen a lot of messed up stuff, but that is one that I've never had to personally experience, and I am thankful for that.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
That would piss me off so much now.
Right.
That realization that person, never had to die. yeah, I fortunately, no, that's never happened to me or anybody that I've known.
Yeah. That is good that it's never directly affected you or your community. But do you know how the Jehovah's Witnesses treat it when that kind of thing happens? Like, do they treat it
Oh
like
yeah.
what do they do?
Um, so if somebody goes to the hospital and they are, for any, medical reason involving their treatment, a doctor says the words blood transfusion, pretty much immediately what, I'm not sure if they still have this or if they changed the name of it or something like that, but at the time that I was in, and because they change stuff all the time. I've only been out for a year and they've changed stuff.
Wow.
So, but anyway, they have a hospital liaison committee, which is basically just a few elders that come in and remind you of what you're supposed to do in this situation, which is to reject a blood transfusion at all costs. Yeah, they basically just go in and remind you, hey, so doctor's saying you need a blood transfusion, but here are some scriptures, and we're going to pray for you, and we're going to stand here too and make sure that the doctors are never alone with you to try and pressure you. And yeah, I had a grandfather who was on the hospital liaison committee, and I knew vaguely what his job was. That was another thing that I didn't really learn until I got out. I knew that the hospital liaison committee existed, and as far as I knew, their job was just to help witnesses who were hospitalized. And then I knew that there were so many witnesses that rejected blood transfusions right up until the end. And I knew that they had brothers and sisters who were, helping them stay strong. But until I got out, I never really made the connection that, the hospital liaison committee is pretty much there to make sure they don't get a blood transfusion.
Right.
Or to do their very best to make sure anyway.
That's crazy. I've never heard that term before. Hospital liaison committee. Is that what you called it?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that is
yeah.
That's fascinating. So I guess what I also mean though is, like, let's say, and maybe you don't know this because you haven't experienced it firsthand, but do you know if somebody dies, from and they can directly attribute it to this person not getting a blood transfusion? Do you know if Jehovah's Witnesses consider that, like, do they sort of, obviously idolize is the wrong word, but, like, do they sort of, like, put that person up on a pedestal? Like, this person was so devout, we need to really.
Oh yeah.
Like, do they sort of see it as a win for Jehovah's Witness?
Absolutely, and it's another one of those things that they often put in the propaganda. There is an Awake magazine. This turns my stomach. There is an Awake magazine that has a picture of a bunch of different children on the front. And it's the title of it is something like, youth who stood for Jehovah or something like that. And basically it's about a bunch of kids who rejected blood transfusions and died.
Fuck.
And yeah, I can't even think about that. It makes me so angry and so disgusted because, this is something that I once defended as a Jehovah's Witness. And I realize now that I really didn't know why. I just did it because I was told it was right. One time in high school, I was homeschooled my entire life up until my junior and senior year, and then I went to public school for the first time. So you can imagine what a culture shock that was for me.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, in my government class, we were talking about freedom of religion, and I happened to scan a couple pages ahead, and I was like, "Oh no, it's coming! Great." So then my teacher is like, "Oh, so Jehovah's Witnesses reject apparently they just reject medical procedures. Rachel, do you want to tell us about that?" And I was like, "Oh, cool, you're going to put me on the spot 5 minutes before the end of class about a really tricky subject. Cool." So I stand up and I'm like, "Okay, well, first of all, you're wrong. we don't reject all medical procedures. Don't tell people that.
Mm-hmm.
But we do reject blood transfusions. And immediately there were people that got on the offensive. And I understand that, because when you hear that, you're like, why? And I gave my little reason. And the next day, the whole ordeal gave me a lot of anxiety, because I was put on the spot and people were looking at me like I was crazy, and they were angry, understandably, because they knew the implication of that immediately. They're like, there are Jehovah's Witnesses who are dead, aren't there? And because of this. And the next day I went to my teacher and I was like, listen, you need to let me go over this again, because now I'm prepared, and that is a really tricky subject. And I cannot just leave with that 5-minute explanation. You need to let me do this again. And she was like, fine, okay. I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. I understand. So basically, I showed people, our little pamphlets and stuff, and I gave a more lengthy explanation about why Jehovah's Witnesses don't accept blood transfusions. And at the end of it, there were still people who were like, okay, let's say you are pregnant and you get into a car crash, and getting a blood transfusion will save you and the baby. And I basically just looked them in the eye and I said, yeah, no, I would still not get a blood transfusion. And that made people angry. And I understood why even then, but I was just not willing to back down on this. And most Jehovah's Witnesses aren't. We're instructed as Jehovah's Witnesses to keep a medical directive, like a legal document in our wallets that say we don't want blood, and to turn over, if I'm unconscious and can't make medical decisions, here is my specific instructions, and here is the person who I will allow to make medical decisions for me, and usually that person is another witness, preferably a family member or an elder in the congregation or something like that. I never ended up filling mine out before I got out, and I'm glad I didn't. I probably would have ripped it up or burned it by now if I had, because, wow, I don't want to die. Don't let anybody think that I don't want a blood transfusion. That's stupid. But I know that my family has those, and my sister probably has one of those, and it gives me a headache to think about. It's a really big issue.
What about donating blood and donating organs when you die?
I'm not sure what the official stance is on organs, if there is one, but I know that witnesses don't donate blood.
Okay.
Because, receiving blood transfusions is something they're opposed to doing, so why would they, contribute to it?
Right.
They think it's not only do they just not want them for themselves, but they believe it's a sin, so they're not going to donate blood to something that they believe is a sinful practice.
I was going to say, it's like, at least they're not a hypocrite in that way, but it's still a messed up thing.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it is.
So you said you were homeschooled for, what would that be then? That would be 15, until you were about 15?
Yep.
And was Jehovah's Witnesses curriculum taught among what you were taught in homeschooling?
I mean, the witnesses, like I said, they are constantly inundated with propaganda. So obviously that was kind of a part of my growing up. That was a big part of my growing up. Like, my parents put my quote-unquote spiritual education above my secular education oftentimes. But I was enrolled in online classes for a lot of it, like K-12. Some of the classes, my mom's best friend homeschooled her kids that were our age. So we would go to her house and she would teach all of us science. And we'd go back to my mom's house and she would teach all of us history out of, the textbooks that they had bought at, like book fairs and stuff like that. Now this is interesting. There was kind of like a homeschool co-op type of thing that I went to in maybe like my freshman year or something like that. Or maybe it was middle school. I think it was middle school. It was basically just a bunch of other homeschool kids came together and got taught by somebody's mom, which just doesn't make any sense, but and we were getting taught, I don't remember what subject it was, but it was out of a Christian Science textbook. So you can imagine how the religious demographic of the class, and you can imagine the biased information within the textbook. I was never really taught what evolution really is. Mm-hmm. I understood the idea of natural selection, and that never didn't make sense to me. But I never really understood. I had never had any detailed information about evolution with which to go off of. So I listened to the creationist textbook. I listened to the creationist propaganda that I was presented with, from Jehovah's Witnesses. They are terrible with quote mining. They can make a scientist sound like that they think that, natural selection is a fairy tale, when that's not the point you're trying to make at all. But they do that a lot. So I grew up believing, that evolution wasn't true, but the few principles of evolution that I understood made sense to me. But even though I thought that it made sense, I still never questioned the idea that evolution was just, a bunch of nonsense and, all of this. Granted, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't young Earth creationists, which makes it a little easier to that pill a little easier to swallow, because they're not trying to say that the Earth was created in a literal 7 days or anything like that. They're picky enough that at least some of what they say makes sense, which makes the rest of it easier to swallow.
Yeah, I get that, and I was raised Quaker, and mm-hmm. it's interesting that, like, when I was not sure about the fact that I was Quaker, it was weird because Quakerism has this whole belief about everything is about peace. And so it's mm-hmm. kind of hard to say that you don't want to be a Quaker anymore when peace is like the backbone of the religion, of the way of thinking. Oh, yeah. Because it's like you're saying that you don't believe in peace. And it's like, well, yeah, I do believe in peace. I just also believe that if someone's attacking me or someone I love, that I'm going to defend myself and not feel bad about it. It doesn't mean that I'm going to go on a shooting spree. It means that I'm going to hurt somebody if they're going to hurt me. Or mm-hmm. if they're going to hurt somebody I love. I mean, that's a very different thing, but it's not allowed in Quakerism. You sort of just have to be, passive is the wrong word. I'll think about the right word, but it's basically just pacifist. Thank you. That's the right word. You have to be a pacifist about everything. Obviously what I'm talking about with Quakerism is different from what you experienced with the Witnesses, but it sounds like they were kind of trying to create arguments that, by making it a little bit more scientific, it gives it a little bit more merit.
Mm-hmm. And Witnesses have the same kind of thing about pacificity. Yeah, that's the word. Mm-hmm. The Jehovah's Witnesses are not gun owners. Jehovah's Witnesses are, I think I had a friend who took karate lessons as a little kid, and even that was frowned upon. Like, I kind of looked at my mom like, he's allowed to take karate lessons? And she was like, yeah, well, his mom lets him do this and that. And it was just kind of like, everybody just kind of knew we don't do that kind of thing. And that's one thing that I can be grateful for, is that I was raised in a cult, but it was not a violent cult by any means. They're very anti-violence. To the point that even, just being an angry person is sinful conduct, which just, that's just ridiculous. I mean, obviously people have anger management issues, and that's one thing, but like they have these kids videos. That's probably some of their most notorious propaganda. I've seen a lot of people make response videos to a lot of these, because they're just terrible. Their production value is pretty good, which actually makes it somehow worse to me. Like, the animation is okay, and somehow the fact that it's pleasing to the eye makes it worse.
Yeah.
But Like they have these like little kids lessons videos, and they teach them things like don't steal, don't lie, clean up after yourself, listen to mom and dad. But the reasons for doing it are always terrible reasons. It's always just because Jehovah says so, and you want to be Jehovah's friend, right? You want to make him happy, right? Then you can't steal. Not, don't steal because stealing is a bad thing to do. Like, they're not teaching any moral principles at all. They're just teaching rules. And I've heard people say before something along the lines of, well, if there is no God, then, and you don't believe in a God, then why don't you just go, raping and pillaging? And I'm like, I do exactly as much raping and pillaging as I would like to do, which is absolutely none. And I wonder why religious people think that way. But then I look at videos like that, and it's teaching kids that the only reason, not to do bad things is specifically to make God happy. And they're not just saying it's bad because it hurts other people, and we live in a society where we need to take care of each other. It's just like you don't do it because God, and that's why. And that just kind of makes me realize where that kind of line of thinking comes from. It's like maybe people don't know how much raping and pillaging they would do if they weren't religious, and that kind of scares me. But it's things like that, like the way that they teach. Their main method of keeping people in seems to be indoctrinating children from a very young age. And I'm losing my train of thought here. I guess the point is that the way that they teach lessons, it's like it's a good lesson, but for all of the wrong reasons. And yet at the same time, they can also teach a bad lesson for all of the wrong reasons. But either way, they tend to be very convincing. They are not really big on debating. In fact, I was told when I was younger, like, don't debate atheists, don't debate people who just want to debate for the sake of debate, because it's pointless. Your goal is to preach. Your goal is to spread the message. If those people aren't listening to the message with the goal of getting anything out of it, and they're just listening to, respond and debate, then that's pointless. Don't even do it. So I never learned any like apologetics or anything like that to try and argue with people. I just learned, all the lines that I was fed that convinced me. And I realized that when I tried to preach to my classmates, those lines did not work. People remained terribly unconvinced, and I never understood why, because I'm like, this is the truth, How can people hear this and not be like, oh yeah, I get it now, Yeah.
Yeah, and as I've been doing this show a little bit more, I've realized that, like, my views on God are that, like, if God is your reason for doing good and it's not harming anybody, you're letting people get blood transfusions, then believe in God and do things for whatever reason. The issue is the extremism, is the stuff where you're hurting people, where you are intolerant, you're violently punishing people, or you're forcing people to die for the sake of this thing. I mean, that's, that is, to me, that's extremism. And what you just described about sorry, now I'm losing my train of thought. Like anger and all of that, like that. I don't know if it was just my family, but my family was really Quaker, and I don't remember anybody getting angry at the Quaker meetings. But I remember that it was definitely taught to me that anger is a horrible thing. And I always just felt like it's an emotion. Like you have that naturally, and it happens. I mean, we're not. You might be able to say that something like, masturbation is a sin. You are actively choosing to do that, but like, you're not actively choosing to get angry. That is just something that happens, and you kind of can't control when that actually does happen.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you on that. And that's a thing that I've noticed with a lot of witnesses. They are told to put on this quote, new personality, to strip off the old personality and put on the new personality. And the new personality is just like a really fake smiley person. Like, that's just all that means, really. I mean, it's this idea that you love everybody, and everybody at the meetings is so nice and so friendly, and everybody seems to genuinely care about each other. And honestly, a lot of people do. A lot of people do genuinely care about each other, even people they don't know very well. If they just happen to notice that somebody's feeling really down, they might do their best to make that person feel better, even if they don't know them very well. In fact, I would say the vast majority of the witnesses that I have known have all been good and decent people who are genuinely kind, but they are forced to put on this really like this persona of like the world's friendliest person.
Yeah.
And
which is exhausting, by the way.
Yeah, it is, especially when it's something that kind of witnesses kind of check each other on.
Yeah.
Like they they keep each other smiling with a little like elbow nudge, like, come on. But yeah. But that is really exhausting. And I consider myself a person who is very in touch with my own emotions. And I realize now that a lot of witnesses that I know are just like emotionally constipated. Like they're not allowed to feel certain things, or they stop themselves from feeling certain things. Obviously, a lot of it is like, sexual desire, that kind of thing. But a lot of it is just any negative emotion of like, just anger, like, and now I'm at a point where I am surrounded by people who don't think that just feeling a certain way is automatically bad. And I'm allowed to, just be angry. I'm allowed to feel like I want to hit something, as long as that thing that I hit is not a person.
Right.
Right. I kind of am in a situation now with, my fiance, for example. I told him, I've made it very clear that if he ever yells at me, that makes me very anxious and very upset. So I prefer that he not yell at me. But I've never told him not to be mad at me.
Right.
Just don't be angry. In fact, we've made it a policy to, if you're mad at me and we're in like public or in a situation where we can't talk about it, to let it go if you can, at least temporarily, until we can work through it. But the point is to work through it as opposed to just ignoring it. And that's just very kind of different. Because I can get into a shouting match with a person, and then later be like, okay, now we've worked through this, we've resolved it, we can let it go, we can move on, and that anger is gone. And it's not because I'm suppressing it; it's because I've worked through it and it's out of my system.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It's just so different from the upbringing that I had. Even though I've kind of always known that you're supposed to work through emotions, a lot of the time I just would, go in my room and cry and come back out smiling, and it's fine. Towards the end, like the last few years before I left, I was very depressed, and I isolated myself a lot from my family and from my friends. I didn't have a lot of friends, but even then, the few that I had, I isolated myself from. And I felt like when I told people that I was having these emotional problems, for the most part, the stuff that they gave me to deal with it was scriptures. And I would read it, and I would expect this peace of God to wash over me. And after a while, that just wasn't a thing that happened anymore. Like that little placebo effect thing wasn't doing it for me anymore. I wasn't getting any peace. I wasn't getting any happiness. There wasn't any joy in it for me anymore. I was purely going through the motions. And it was probably, some of the most depressing time of my life was maybe like probably just from the ages 15 to 18 were probably just some of the most depressing years of my life.
How are you feeling now?
I feel awesome. I feel like every day I wake up next to somebody that I love, and I go to work at a job that I like, and I'm surrounded by people that I like and who like me, and then I can consciously think, these people if I told them I was an atheist today and a Buddhist tomorrow, and the next day I told them that I was a Jehovah's Witness again, they would be like, okay, Rachel. And they would just move on. Mm-hmm. And they wouldn't, like, me changing my beliefs, every 10 seconds wouldn't faze them. They would still be with me. The only thing that, one of these people would stop being friends with me for is if I did something to hurt them, and not just living my life. Obviously, I am not happy about being separated from my family. That's the only thing in my life really right now that's keeping me down. Everything else is pretty much just awesome and great. And I'm very optimistic about my future, which I haven't been for a long time. Did I mention that Jehovah's Witnesses believe that there is going to be, like the War of Armageddon very soon?
Oh, so they're like, do they have like the Armageddon prophecies, like that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. The Jehovah's Witnesses in the past have prophesied certain dates, or at least even like certain years that they think the end is going to come, and obviously it's never happened. And every time they did that, a bunch of people left. And every time they just revised their prophecies and been like, oh, it's actually a little bit later. It's actually right here. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And right now, they're like, they've got this one prophecy that's like something about generations and contemporaries, and it used to be that starting from the people that were alive during 1914 is a very special year for them. They think it's the year that Christ came back. It's also, at one point, that was going to be the year that the end would come, but they were wrong about that, obviously, because, 1914 was a little over 100 years ago.
Right.
But they had this idea that, that Jesus came back that year, and all the people that were alive that year were not going to die before, before the end came. And obviously, like I said, it's been over 100 years from then, so most likely all those people are dead. And now they're kind of saying, oh, well, the people that were contemporaries of those people that, like, were alive when those people were still alive, like when they were really old, the people that knew them, those people are not going to die before the end comes. And it's really convoluted, their little prophecy thing now. And I don't think it's going to go on much longer because they've really stretched it thin. I don't know how they're going to reinterpret that one. But they're basically expecting the end to come within the next 10 years. And I was taught that the end was going to come within my lifetime. I was taught, well, pretty much every Jehovah's Witness ever was taught that the end was going to come before they graduated high school. And obviously that is not true for a bunch of people. But I was pretty convinced, as everybody before me was, that the end was going to come before I graduated high school. I graduated high school. Everybody was like, well, your kids don't graduate high school. In fact, your kids are probably going to be born in the new paradise earth, Like, the end's certainly going to come soon. They are always 100% convinced of that, despite the countless failed prophecies.
This concludes part 1. In the next episode, Rachel talks about how her friends had an impact on her faith. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. Most importantly, share the show with someone you trust.